Hello and welcome. I'm Ali Mustafa and this is Straight Talk. Hundreds of Palestinian teenagers are languishing in Israeli prisons. What's behind Israel's heavy hand against young activists? And we break down the extent of the PKK terror group's tentacles across the region. It was an act of defiance that has become a new symbol of resistance against Israeli occupation. The image of a young Palestinian girl slapping an Israeli soldier put the spotlight on the plight of hundreds of Palestinian minors locked up in Israeli prisons. 17-year-old Ahed al Tamimi became that unwitting heroine. Her trial, which was supposed to begin this week, has been postponed till February 13th, leaving her family with more questions about their daughter's fate. All this comes as reports surface that another Palestinian child has been shot dead by Israeli forces. Our own Adil Halim sat down with Tamimi's family in the occupied West Bank. Here's his report.
Her name has reverberated around the world as the face of the Palestinian struggle. But all of that is of little comfort for Bassem Tamimi.
Yes, I am proud because she is strong, because she became a symbol or an icon for her generation. Also, this has happened because of occupation. She lost her childhood because of occupation. She don't need to be a hero or a freedom fighter. She needs to be a human being.
His daughter, Ahed Tamimi, recently spent her 17th birthday in jail for slapping two Israeli security forces.
After Trump slapped all the Arab and the Muslim nations and people, we have this is slapped from a small child.
She's been hailed as a hero by Palestinians, while Israelis accuse her family of using the teen as a pawn in staged provocations.
If it's true, how their soldiers involved in our propaganda?
It's not the first time Ahed has confronted soldiers. In 2012, then a preteen, Ahed was awarded a prestigious Courage Award in Turkey. The medal sits in her empty bedroom. Despite human rights groups calling for her release, Ahed Tamimi will remain in custody during her trial, which could last months. Her lawyer argues the detention violates international child welfare conventions. Tamimi's story is not unusual. The UNHCR has criticized the actions of Israeli authorities in her case, while the European Union has expressed concern over Israel's detention of minors. According to Palestinian figures, more than 6,400 Palestinians are being held in Israeli prisons, including 300 children. Last month, the Palestinian authorities submitted a formal complaint to the International Criminal Court specifically over Israel's violations against Palestinian children. This picture instantly went viral on social media. A blindfolded boy being led away by armed soldiers, guns drawn.
I was going somewhere when several sound and gas bombs went off. I escaped until I reached an area where soldiers were hiding. Once I got there, they came out and started to beat me. A soldier caught me and hit me in the chest with his weapon. I fell to the ground, and they all continued to beat me.
His time in prison wasn't any easier. The language barrier with soldiers was a challenge. Al-Junaidi claims he didn't get to see any family members for more than 3 weeks. The teen and his father came to Turkey for medical care, for which he is thankful. It was his first time leaving Palestine. With a mother who is sick, a father who is disabled, and 8 young siblings, Al-Junaidi left school to be the family's sole breadwinner. Yet, through it all, his dream is simple.
My wish is to live normally like any other person, to have all my basic rights, and to be able to move as I wish and not be controlled by any occupation to do as they wish.
Back in the occupied West Bank, Tamimi can't help but longingly wish for his daughter's return.
When I remember, I see my love, my soul, my heart inside this court, inside this prison, with my enemy, without any trust of any justice or morality with the occupier, I feel scared, sad.
Ahed al Halim, Straight Talk, Nabi Saleh in the occupied West Bank.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined in the studio by Asaf, Ronel, he's the World News editor for Haaretz, and by Abdullah Marouf, who is a lecturer at Istanbul's 29 Mayıs University. Thank you so much for both of you for being here. Let's begin with you, Asaf. I guess it's a simple question, but why is it that the Israeli authorities and the occupation targets young activists and detains them and charges them with stone pelting, for example?
So many young Palestinians were confronted Israeli soldiers on their lands, in their towns, in their villages, and were violently met a violent response by the Israeli soldiers. Ahed al Tamimi's case is unique because, first of all, it was in front of the cameras, and then, second of all, the Israeli soldiers didn't respond in the first point. And the video of Ahed standing on her land, kicking and slapping Israeli soldiers and actually pushing them away from her land and gaining a victory became a focal point for Israeli public who felt like they lost. And then the response was, if you're looking at the Israeli public response to what happened on the first incident, once it was filmed, you had the spectrum moved between how brave were our soldiers who didn't respond to the provocation.
So let's put it in a broader term. Was it more of a slight because the soldiers didn't respond?
Yes, exactly.
For the Israeli public?
Yes. Many responses were they should have beaten her up. They should have responded. They shouldn't have retreated. This is like one part of society. The other was they were so brave, they didn't respond, they didn't fall into the Palestinian provocation. They were not inside the Israeli public, at least if you don't consider the radical left, or at least the fringes of the Zionist left. Most of them didn't think about what Ahed al Tamimi was doing as something that is right, that a young woman, a teenager, was standing outside her house. Two fully armed men were standing in front of her and blocking the way to her house, and she pushed them away.
Let's try to broaden it up, pull it out a bit. Ahed al Tamimi isn't the only case. We've had instances, in fact, 8,000 Palestinian minors have been detained since 2000. Up to 700 Palestinian minors are detained every year. Majority of the detained minors are charged with throwing or pelting stones. 3 out of 4 minors are physically abused during detention, and only 10% have had an access to a lawyer. Tell us the Palestinian perspective.
Ahed al Tamimi was not and is not the only child who was abused by the Israeli court system today. For example, no one of the Palestinian side forgets what happened to Mohammed Abu Khtair in 2014, who was burned alive, who was 16 years old. And no one as well forgets about Ahmed Manasra, who was charged was sentenced to 12 years in prison, who was 13 years old when he was run out by an Israeli soldier in Jerusalem.
UNICEF released a report in 2012 and concludes that the ill treatment of children who come in contact with the military detention system appears to be widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process. Is it institutionalized to that extent?
No doubt. There is the bureaucracy of the detention of Palestinians is blind. There was a quite shocking case last week. It was discovered last week. A few weeks ago, a young Palestinian girl, 14 years old, was arrested on a bus in Jerusalem because she was begging for money. The officers took her to detention. Her uncle paid the bail. They decided to keep her for the night in jail, and then they put her on a car and they drove her to Gaza.
So it's a question of an unequal or power.
It's not only that, actually. It's institutionalized more than that. My personal child, was born in Jerusalem, yet he doesn't have an ID and he cannot go to Jerusalem today. Why? Because at the moment when he was born, I was in Mecca doing pilgrimage. So the Israeli Ministry of Interior refused to give him citizenship. Why? Because only his mother was at that point. That means legally, according to the Israelis, legally, if I was in Ramallah, if I was in Bethlehem, it would have been the same case.
And it's not just
So
it's not just about the occupation. There are different levels of the occupation.
Yes.
For example, people in Jerusalem have a different ID as opposed to people in the West Bank or elsewhere in the occupied territories. So it's quite unequal. I want to bring this back to reaction from the Israeli society, and I want to highlight Israeli poet and songwriter Yehonatan Geffen, who compared Ahed al Tamimi to Anne Frank, another symbol of the Jewish experience, and he later had to apologize for it. My question to you is, why is it so hard for Israelis to accept comparisons, however controversial, between the suffering of Palestinian youth and that of Jewish youth during the Holocaust?
I think that the comparison to the Holocaust for almost all Israelis is a taboo, which you don't compare things to the Holocaust because it was a unique experience. In the Israeli discourse of the conflict with the Palestinians, the Israelis keep blaming the Palestinians of using their weakness as a weapon. As the younger you are, the weaker you are, then your weapon is more powerful. The Ahed al Tamimi case is considered by most Israelis as a deliberate provocation to hurt the Israelis. No matter the fact that sending the army in the middle of the night to arrest her hurt the Israelis around the world much more than in the first video, because it only proved what was seen in the first video, that the Israelis are using violence against young women, young teenagers, even though I must say the PR event of arresting Ahed al Tamimi in the middle of the night was unique. They sent women soldiers to arrest her. Usually when they are breaking into houses of Palestinians in the middle of the night to arrest teenagers, they don't bother with male, female, but this time, because they knew they will get focused, that they wanted to see that the occupation is humane, so they sent women soldiers so that it would look better. Someone thought it might look better.
Abdullah, I'll give you the last word.
The issue of arresting the youth in Palestine, it's not the only problem that the youth are suffering actually under the occupation. There is no humane occupation and inhumane occupation. All occupation is inhumane. The Israelis should ask themselves, and the world should ask itself, why the youth are being oppressed in their land and oppressed in every day of their life. The youth in Palestine do have a lot of problems in their education system. They have a lot of problem in their everyday life. They have a lot of problems of drugs actually. In Jerusalem itself, almost 0.5 kilogram in the eastern side of Jerusalem being distributed amongst the youth of drugs every day. So we're speaking about a whole life being oppressed in their whole life. So an occupation is an occupation. It's always unaccepted and always illegal.
Abdullah, Marouf, Asaf, Ronel, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been 3 weeks since Turkey launched Operation Olive Branch to clear Syria's Afrin region of the PKK-linked YPG terror group. The campaign has seen fighting in pockets along Afrin's north and western borders with Turkey. Free Syrian Army opposition fighters backed by the Turkish military have surrounded Rajo Mountain in the northwest. Turkish-backed forces have also captured several villages from the YPG. There are also reports that pro-regime forces attacked US-backed YPG positions in Manbij. The alleged attack prompted a massive US response, with reports saying dozens of pro-regime fighters had been killed. For Ankara, the aim of the fight for Afrin is to remove a major threat from Turkey's borders. And that threat has been festering for decades within Turkey itself. Since launching its deadly campaign against the Turkish state in 1984, the PKK terror group has franchised and morphed into many groups that are now operating in several countries, as Omer Kablan explains.
The PKK is listed as a terrorist organization by the United States, Turkey, and the European Union. An estimated 40,000 people have been killed in Turkey since the terror group began fighting the state in 1984. It reportedly recruits child soldiers and has been accused of ethnic cleansing and other war crimes. Unlike Al-Qaeda, it operates other sub-branches. According to a 2015 report, the PKK has a track record of allying with various terrorist groups like the Tamil Tigers, who were in Sri Lanka. In March 2016, a terror attack struck the heart of Turkey's capital. 38 people were killed and more than 100 injured when a car bomb exploded in a busy Ankara district. The Kurdistan Freedom Eagles, also known as TUK, claimed responsibility for the attack. The group was established as an offshoot of the PKK in 2004. The Ankara bomber was 24-year-old Seher Çağlademir. Turkey's Interior Ministry said she was trained in Syria by the YPG, another PKK offshoot, formed in 2003. In 1999, the PKK's founder, Abdullah Öcalan, was arrested, plunging his terror group into crisis. At its 2002 Congress, the PKK created the Kurdistan Freedom and Democracy Congress, known as KADEK. At the helm was still imprisoned leader Abdullah Öcalan. The PKK remained under him, and together with subgroups like TUK, it began operating mainly in western Turkey. And then its other sub-branches spread outwards, with the PYD-YPG in Syria, the PCDK in Iraq, and PJAK in Iran, all reporting to KADEK headquarters. Former YPG commander and spokesman Talal Silo defected from the group in 2017. He says the YPG and affiliated groups are part of the same hierarchy.
I was first invited to join Jaish al-Suvar, the revolutionaries' army in Afrin, and I accepted and joined the ranks in August 2015. I was responsible for Turkmen regiments, but the decision-maker was Hadro from PKK. Then, later on, I was told I would be joining the SDF. The first meeting was with the regional director of PKK, Sahin Jilo.
The Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, is comprised mainly of YPG militants that the US government is arming and providing with aerial support to fight Daesh. As with any criminal franchise, money has been keeping the group operational. The PKK is known to be involved in narco-trafficking, taxing lucrative smuggling routes connecting Europe and Asia. There's also evidence it raises funds through extortion in European countries like Germany. With a growing global network and the threat to match, Turkey is asking why such a terror group is being armed and trained by one of its closest allies. Ahmad Kavlan, Straight Talk.
And to discuss this further, joining me in the studio is Mehmet Çelik. He's the political editor for the Daily Sabah newspaper, and also Hussein Alptekin. He is a professor at Istanbul Şehir University. He's also involved with the Turkish think tank SETA. Let's begin with you, Hussein. How was the PKK over 40 years able to franchise and spread so effectively, not just in Turkey, but across the region?
Actually, the franchise process for the PKK is not something new. We talk more about that today because of the Syrian civil war, but actually the PKK itself grew stronger and expanded from Syria. Because when the organization moved to Syria in early 80s, that was the place where the organization built its initial camps, and the leader of the organization, Abdullah Öcalan, lived in this country until he was forced to leave the country and captured in 1999. So that's one of the root countries of the PKK. They were going there from Turkey, they were Turkish citizens, but the organizational structure was formed basically in Syria.
Let's show our viewers a map of where the PKK is in the Middle East. They have a franchise in Syria, as you mentioned, the PYD, and its arm being the YPG. They've got an offshoot also operating in Iraq and in Iran as well. Centered, of course, in the Kandil Mountains in Iraq. Was the Turkish response over these 40 years adequate to stop the spread of the PKK, Mehmet?
I think Turkey, as a state, did what it can. At the same time, we should acknowledge that there were some gaps in their policies. However, we should also acknowledge that while Turkey was fighting against this terrorist organization under the name of PKK, what were its allies doing is another question we should ask. Because when we see that the PKK is using some of the very sophisticated weapons against Turkish army, or how PKK was able to establish itself across European cities for its financial resources, how it is able to make recruitments from European cities to join its lines, we should ask how was it Turkey's allies was helping Turkey to fight this franchise, which is not a franchise, which is not an organization that is only existing in Turkey. Because in the 90s, PKK was a problem of Turkey in the southeast. But now, throughout its development, we see that PKK has established itself across northern Syria, northern Iraq, and Iran as well. But its main source of life comes from the western parts of the world.
It's interesting you mentioned that. And the US, EU, other European countries inside the EU consider the PKK to be a terrorist group. Yes. It's prescribed. On the other hand, when you mention friends, the US has been arming the PKK in Syria, and specifically the YPG, which is the offshoot of the PKK. Let's listen in to an exchange a few years ago between Senator Lindsey Graham and the then US Defense Secretary Ash Carter, and listen to what they had to say.
Reports indicate that they're aligned or at least have substantial ties to the PKK. Is that true?
Yes, we have.
Is the PKK a terrorist organization in the eyes of the Turkish government?
The PKK is a terrorist organization not only in the eyes of the Turkish government, but in the eyes of the U.S. government as well, Senator.
So we saw that exchange from a few years ago. Hussein, tell us about the U.S. involvement in basically consolidating the PKK and YPG's hold in places like Syria.
Which is quite shocking for Turkey, actually, because Turkey and the United States have been very strong allies, and they managed to work out many problematic issues in the region in the past. But when we look at the past of these relationships, even the capture of the Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the organization, was a result of a cooperation between the Turkish and American secret services. But now when we look at the situation today in Syria, that's quite shocking for Turkey, actually, that the United States is helping and arming and sheltering such a terrorist organization in Syria.
But the US has also said, and it has maintained, that the YPG, yes, it has links to the PKK, but it is still instrumental in fighting Daesh. And that brings us to what's happening today. We've got Turkish soldiers in Afrin fighting the YPG. You've got Manbij in play, where US forces are stationed alongside the YPG, and that is becoming a little fractious as well, especially as far as the regime is concerned. Reports of fighting between regime forces and SDF YPG in Manbij. Do you think Turkey took too long, as far as the crisis in Syria is concerned, to allow the YPG an opportunity?
Turkey wanted to solve the problem through dialogue and diplomatic channels with its NATO ally, which have been one of the strongest allies in NATO, Turkey and the US. But the US unfortunately kept failing in keeping up its promises with Turkey. I mean, during the Obama administration, it was said that the YPG forces will not cross to the west of the Euphrates, and they will go back to the east of Euphrates. But unfortunately, while that didn't happen, the U.S. administration kept arming the group as well. So Turkey waited a little bit and wanted to see how this will continue during the Trump administration. But unfortunately, due to the domestic relations in the U.S. government, particularly the rivalry, almost we can say a rivalry between White House, Pentagon, and CENTCOM, the relation between Turkey and the U.S. has been even further complicated, because the U.S. the White House is now also supporting the YPG, same as it happened during the Obama administration.
I want to very quickly bring in Hussein here. You were talking about a historic relation where Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, was giving refuge, and Syria was giving refuge to Abdullah Öcalan till he was told to leave under pressure. Tell us about the present-day relationship between Bashar al-Assad and the YPG. It's quite a complicated relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, the relations are quite complicated in Syria because we don't have just two sides. There are multiple parties there. There is the regime forces, there is the YPG, there was and still is the Daesh threat, and there are other rebels. And the alliances are shifting very dramatically, very radically, very fast. And in some cases, we see that these two actors, the YPG forces and the regime forces, had this tacit mutual understanding that they will not be in each other's way. We saw some sporadic clashes between the two regimes, between the two actors, but for most of the time they avoided a direct clash and just waited for the post-Daesh period.
Hussein, I'm afraid we'd have to leave it there. Hussein Altekin and Mehmet Çelik, thank you so much. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ali Mustafa. If you've got any comments or suggestions, do share them with us at #StraightTalk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.